True Gay Crime contains coarse language, adult themes, and content that is violent and disturbing. If at any time you feel you need help, please refer to the toll-free crisis lines in the show notes. Welcome to another episode of True Gay Crime. I'm your host, Patrick Marano, and on today's episode, we cover the 1959 Clutter family murders, a crime involving two ex-cons and one famous literary personality, Truman Capote. Okay, the sources I have for this story, I wikied a lot with Truman Capote, the Clutter murders, Perry Smith, Richard Hickok, also an interesting article on medium.com, and I also got one off of people.com. So without further ado, let's hear the story of the Clutter family murders and its ties to one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. San Francisco, 1974. Truman Capote addresses a crowd at the International Film Festival talking about the time he spent in Kansas researching his book, In Cold Blood. Quote, "And one day I was gleaning the New York Times, and way back on the page I saw this very small item, and it just said, 'Kansas farmer slain. Family of 4 is slain in Kansas.' A little item just about like that. And the community was completely nonplussed. And it was this total mystery of how it could have been and what happened. I don't know what it was. I think it was that I knew nothing about Kansas or that part of the country or anything. And I thought, well, this could be a fresh perspective for me. And I said, well, I'm going to go out there and just look around and see what this is. And so maybe this is the subject I've been looking for. I stayed there and kept researching it and got very friendly with the various authorities and the detectives on the case. They could have never caught the killers, but as it so happened, they did catch them. In January, the case is solved, and then I made very close contact with these two boys and saw them very often over the next 4 years. So just how close did he get to the two men who were convicted of killing an entire family, and what effect would the case have on Capote for the rest of his life? Let's find out. Truman Garcia Capote, born Truman Streckfuss Persons. Like, his birth name is really bad. Hold on. Truman Streckfuss Persons. Wow. On September 30th, 1924, in New Orleans, Louisiana. His mom is Lily Mae, and his salesman dad is Archelaus. Archie. Oh, is that Archie? Is that the long form of Archie? Archelaus? Wow. You don't hear that anymore. Oh, hi, you don't hear that name anymore, do ya? You see? His parents get a divorce when he's only 4, and he's sent away to Monroeville, Alabama, where his mom's relatives raise him for the next 5 years. There must have been something in the water in Monroeville, because guess who is his neighbor and actually becomes one of his closest friends? Harper Lee. She's the one that writes To Kill a Mockingbird, which you probably read in school. I know I did. The character of Dill in the book is actually modeled after her friend Capote. So Capote spends a lot of time alone. He teaches himself how to read and write even before he starts the first grade. And at 5 years old, you can see him carrying around a dictionary and a notepad. And by 11, he's full on writing fiction, and he gets christened with the nickname Bulldog. I don't know why the kids were calling him Bulldog. I can only think because maybe he looked like one. That's my guess. In 1932, he moves to New York City to live with his mom and her new husband, Jose Garcia Capote, who adopts him as a son and gives him his new name. Thank God. Unfortunately, Jose is convicted of embezzlement. That's nice. He loses everything, and the family have to move away from Park Avenue. Capote says of those young days, quote, "I was writing really sort of serious when I was about 11. I say seriously in the sense that like other kids go home and practice the violin or the piano or whatever, I used to go home from school every day, and I would write for about 3 hours. I was obsessed by it." In New York, he goes to the Trinity School and then St. Joseph's Military Academy, and in 1939, the family moves to Greenwich, Connecticut, so they always sort of had money. Like, they weren't poor. And Capote goes to high school in Connecticut. He writes for the school newspaper and its literary journal. Then back in New York City, he goes to the Upper West Side private school, and he graduates in 1942. While he's still in private school, Capote begins working as a copy boy in the art department of the New Yorker, where he stays for 2 years until he gets fired for pissing off the famous poet Robert Frost. Capote would later say that the job was, quote, not a very grand job, for all it really involved was sorting cartoons and clipping newspapers. Still, I was fortunate to have it, especially since I was determined never to set a studious foot inside a college classroom. I felt that either one was or wasn't a writer, and no combination of professors could influence the outcome. I still think that's correct, at least in my own case. Determined to make it as a writer, he moves down to Alabama to stay with relatives, and he starts work on his first novel, Summer Crossing. But his first published novel is Other Voices, Other Rooms, and he finds huge success with this one. But his most famous novel would later come in 1958, and that one is called Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's a short novel, and Holly Golightly, as the heroine of Capote's novel, becomes one of his best-known creations. Norman Mailer, who is an American novelist, journalist, filmmaker, and who co-founded The Village Voice in 1955, which is pretty cool. You might remember The Village Voice playing a big role in the Bag Murders with Paul Bateson, because there was that huge article on the cover that was written on the cover of The Village Voice about how the police weren't... Anyway, so that's The Village Voice. This guy, co-founded it in 1955, Norman Mailer. He calls Capote, quote, the most perfect writer of my generation, end quote. The short novel is supposed to run in Harper's Bazaar, but the publisher freaks out, thinking the subject matter might be a little too racy for their advertisers, which, ironically, include the store, the jeweler, Tiffany's. And so Capote takes it to Esquire, and they run it in the November 1958 issue. And it's later published, of course, by Random House. Now, if you haven't read the book, you for sure have seen the movie. And if you haven't done either, then I would like to revoke your gay card immediately, please, because Breakfast at Tiffany's is essential gay viewing. You need to see it for a bunch of reasons. You need to see it for the glamour. You need to see it for the performances, the quotable lines, the cringy, racist performance by Mickey Rooney imitating a Japanese landlord. You can't make that. I mean, watching it now, you're like, oh, boy, wow, it's cringy. I mean, you could never get away with that today. Okay, the movie is made in 1961. It is adapted, as we know, from Capote's book, starring Audrey Hepburn, who was made into a Barbie doll by Robert Best. This is all connecting way too well, this episode. Okay. So it stars Audrey Hepburn and George Peppard, and it's a huge success on its releasing, grossing $14 million in those days, which is way more today. The movie gets 5 nominations at the 34th Academy Awards, including a Best Actress nod for Hepburn, and the film is considered, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the U.S. Library of Congress, and it's selected to be preserved in the National Film Registry in 2012. So it's a big deal. Just go watch it. Capote, as a person, is, shall we say, unique. He's got this high-pitched voice. He's got this bizarre vocal mannerisms, an offbeat way of dressing. He likes to tell stories, which are basically just lies. His stories are about being BFFs with Greta Garbo, which isn't true, and bagging straight men like Errol Flynn, which again is not true. His friends run the gamut. He socializes with authors, critics, business tycoons, philanthropists, Hollywood celebrities, and even royalty. And if you haven't guessed it already, Truman Capote is a huge homo. His first partner, also an award-winning writer, gets a dedication from Capote in his wildly popular first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, but he would spend most of his life with another man named Jack Dunphy, also a writer. These writer types gotta stick together, you know? Although his relationship with Dunphy lasted most of his life, there are stretches of their time together where they basically live in different worlds, different properties, different sides of the country. At times they lived apart, and as Dunphy put it, quote, spared him the anguish of watching Capote drink and take drugs. But that's to come in a little bit. Capote never becomes a gay who would lead a protest or be very vocal about fighting for gay rights, but he's living openly as a gay man, and the mere fact that he's open about being gay and being a celebrity makes him an important person in the gay rights movement. But this isn't a popular culture podcast. This is a true crime podcast with a gay twist. So, we met the gay twist. His name is Truman Capote. And as we heard, he publishes Breakfast at Tiffany's with Random House in 1958. That is 1 year before the heinous murders of the Clutter family in Kansas. Now that we know who Capote is, let's find out who the perpetrators of the murders are. The first of the two men who are involved in the murders is named Richard Hickok. He's born June 6, 1931 in Kansas City, Kansas, to a farming family. He's one of many kids who have a strict upbringing. When he's a kid, they up and move to East Kansas, where he's a popular student because he's an athlete, in high school. After graduation, his family's too poor to send him to college, so he gets a job as a mechanic instead. In 1950, he's in a car wreck, and it scars his face and leaves him looking a bit lopsided. The accident almost kills him, and according to his brother, it changed him forever. Because of the hospital bills from the accident, which he can't pay, he starts down a bad financial path of writing bad checks and gambling. See, in Canada, if you're in a car wreck, we cover you. How awful if you're in an accident and it scars you physically, and then you go into debt because you don't have the money to pay the hospital bill. So maybe if Hickok lived in Canada, he wouldn't have become a criminal. Food for thought. When he's 19 years old, he gets married, but also starts an affair. The mistress gets pregnant, and then he gets his first child that way. So he ends his marriage, and he marries his mistress. And they have 2 kids. But it's a rough start for him, and he goes through a bunch of different jobs, including as a railroad worker, mechanic, and ambulance driver, all the while writing bad checks and committing petty theft. But eventually he's caught for stealing a rifle out of someone's home at 26, and he goes to prison for the first time. And while in prison, his second wife is like, bye bitch, and she divorces him. Okay, that's the first guy. This is the second guy. His name is Perry Edward Smith. He's born on October 27th, 1928 in Huntington, Nevada. His parents, Flo Buckskin and Tex Smith. I mean, these names, those can't be real names. These are like fake. These are like stripper names or porn names. Flo Buckskin? Come on. His mom's name is Flo Buckskin, and his dad's name is Tex Smith. Okay, Flo and Tex are kind of their nicknames, but still, I mean, like. But guess what they do? They're rodeo performers. So I guess, if you're a rodeo performer, do you get like a cool nickname, like a porn name? You get to like make up something. Tex Smith and Flo Buckskin. Okay, sorry about that. Wait, where was I? When he's 1 year old, they move to Juneau, Alaska, where they make bootleg whiskey, because this, remember, is during the Prohibition, which, by the way, lasts 13 years. Did you know that? Google says that Prohibition lasted 13. Now, I know everyone was drinking and there was all this like underground booze channels and stuff like that, but still the fact that you couldn't, like, I'm upset living in Ontario, Canada, where in most grocery stores, you can't buy alcohol. You have to go to the LCBO. If you live in Ontario, you know what I'm talking about. Like, in Quebec, you can go to any dépanneur, any convenience store, any grocery store. You can get booze anywhere. I mean, you don't even have to think about it. Here, you have to like time it. And if it's like a holiday, then the LCBO is closed, then you're completely fucked. You have to go to maybe to the wine store, but the selection is like so limited. It's so stupid. Oh, wow. Sorry. I didn't mean to get so upset about it. Okay, so they're living in Juneau, Alaska. They're making bootleg whiskey. His father is abusive to his mom and to all 4 kids. And finally, in 1935, Flo Buckskin grabs the kids and hightails it out west to San Francisco. I picture her like grabbing the kids and then jumping on a horse and just like galloping down to San Francisco. I'm sure that wasn't the case. Unfortunately for the kids, Flo is an alcoholic who eventually chokes on her own vomit when Smith is 13 years old and dies. Like, what a way to go. Can you imagine? Choking on your own vomit. I hope she was unconscious when that happened. He and his siblings are sent to a Catholic orphanage where this is such a classic story. I mean, how many times? He and his siblings are sent to a Catholic orphanage where the nuns abuse them physically and emotionally. Is there ever a good story about an orphanage where the kids are treated nicely? I mean, how many stories do we have to hear like this? And then he's taken to the Salvation Army orphanage where a caretaker tries to drown him. I mean, who's running these places? As a teen, Smith seeks out his father and they live a transient lifestyle crisscrossing the western United States. No surprise, he joins a street gang and goes to juvie for a while. For his father's part, he ends up in Cold Springs, Nevada, where at 92 years old, he gets so upset about his failing health that he commits suicide. You get all the way to 92 and then you end it? I mean, of course your health is failing. You're 92. Most people don't even get that. I mean, okay, suicide obviously runs in the family because two of his other siblings also commit suicide as young adults, and his remaining sister cuts all ties with him. At 16 years old, he joins the U.S. Marines, and in 1948, he joins the U.S. Army, where he goes to fight in the Korean War. This is, of course, another case of a future killer having been in the Army. Those stories are also countless. He's discharged in 1952 when he goes to live with a friend in the Tacoma, Washington area. He gets a job as a car painter. With one of his first paychecks, he goes out, he buys a motorcycle. One day, he's riding the motorcycle in bad weather. He loses control of the bike, and he gets into a terrible accident. He almost dies and spends 6 months in the hospital. When he gets out, he suffers from chronic leg pain for the rest of his life, and he abuses aspirin to control the pain. Okay. First of all, can you believe both of these guys, both of them, these future murderers who become friends and then commit this crime together, got in these horrible accidents and almost died and were essentially disfigured because of it? Isn't that weird? What a strange thing that it happened to both of them. So he's got pain. His life is going nowhere. He spirals down a crime path. Fast forward, he meets Smith in prison. So Smith and Hickok meet. They become friends, and a cellmate named Floyd Wells tells them he used to work over at the Clutter family home and how they have money lying around the house. He tells Hickok that Mr. Clutter has a safe in the house that has $10,000 in it, which would be a lot by today's standards. So imagine $10,000 in like 1959. So Hickok and his buddy Perry Smith come up with a plan to get that $10,000 once they get out of jail. Hickok is eventually released in August 1959 and starts work at a body shop trying to live an honest life. But in the back of his head, there's that little nagging $10,000, just like, hey, come steal me. So his honest life does not last long, and he contacts Smith, who was already out on parole, and immediately they start planning the robbery of the Clutter family money. So Hickok writes to Smith asking him to break his parole and meet him in Kansas to commit the robbery. Smith would later say that he didn't come back to Kansas for Hickok, but for another cellmate who he had gotten really close with named Willie J. And I'm kind of thinking that they had a little gay thing going on here because I'm basing this on the fact that later Smith gets close to Truman Capote. Anyway, you can decide for yourself. You'll see. So Smith comes back to Kansas, but he misses Willie J just by hours. Like Willie J gets on a bus for the East Coast, and then Smith is like, shows up at the bus station, and he just missed him. So that's kind of sad. He missed his boo. So since Smith is in Kansas anyway, he contacts Hickok, and they start to put the wheels in motion for their robbery. The plan was to steal the safe from the Clutter home and start a new life in Mexico. The Clutter family home was situated in western Kansas. Herb Clutter was the head of the household and a prosperous farmer who employed 18 farmhands. He was adored and respected in the community for his fair treatment and good wages. His two eldest daughters had already moved out and started their own families, leaving only his wife Bonnie, who incidentally suffered from depression and other physical ailments since the birth of her kids, which, kids can bring you down, man. Also, his 16-year-old daughter was there, Nancy, and their 15-year-old son, Kenyon, who live in the house, and they go to high school. So, on November 14th, 1959, Hickok and Smith drive over 400 miles across the state of Kansas to reach the Clutter family home just outside a small farming community called Holcomb, Kansas. It's just after midnight that the pair pull up to the Clutter place, and they cut the engine. Sneaking through the brush, they make their way to the back door, which is unlocked. They enter the house and quietly start searching for the safe while the family sleep upstairs. Lock your doors! Okay, it's 1959. I get it. It's rural Kansas. It was a different time. But everyone who's listening to this, just lock your doors. Unable to, well, they probably would have gotten in anyway, but, don't make it so easy. Okay. Unable to find a safe downstairs, they head upstairs to the bedrooms. That's when Herb wakes up to find two men standing over him and his wife. There's a struggle and shouts as the husband and wife are bound and gagged. Then the son Kenyon, now awake, is afraid. He races downstairs to try to escape. He's overpowered and bound and gagged and thrown on a couch. Then the daughter Nancy is bound and gagged in her bed. With the family tied up and incapacitated, Hickok and Smith continue to search the house looking for anything of value. They basically have given up on the safe idea and they're just like, there's no fucking safe. Just, is there anything, I was going to say a DVD player. That would be weird. Can you imagine? They're like, what the fuck is this? There's a DVD player. So now they're angry at the waste of time and confused as what to do next. The men deliberate. Could they just leave the family tied up? Shouldn't they get rid of the witnesses? Eventually it's decided they can't leave any witnesses. So Smith, of the two of them, was more, shall we say, unstable and prone to fits of rage and violence, and he slits Herb Clutter's throat before shooting him in the head. I mean, why did you have to cut his throat first? Couldn't you just shoot him in the head? Like, save him the... That seems a little mean. Smith would later tell police, quote, I didn't want to harm the man. I thought he was a very nice gentleman, soft-spoken. I thought so right up until the moment I cut his throat. I mean, that's a fucked up thing to say. One by one, the family is murdered by a single gunshot to the head. The 4 victims are later buried at Valley View Cemetery in Garden City, Kansas. Hickok would later tell police that he stopped Smith from raping the teenage daughter. Oh, wow. Do you want a medal? The men leave the home with a small portable radio, a pair of binoculars, and less than $50 in cash. Because as it turns out, Herb Clutter not only didn't have a safe full of cash, but he was notorious for paying for everything by check, and he never carried any cash at all on him. So they got some really bad information by their cellmate Floyd Wells. So the two men are on the run, but they don't get far. Because back in prison, Floyd Wells, who, of course, is the one that told them that he used to work at the Clutter farm and knew about the safe, he hears about the robbery/murder, and he tips off the authorities that it's Hickok and Smith. What a fucking rat. Who says that? First of all, you were all in prison together, and then they were not privy to that information. You told them about the Clutter family home. You told them that there was a $10,000 safe hidden somewhere in the house. You put the idea in their head, and then they get out on parole and stuff, and then they actually go and commit the crime looking for the safe that you told them was there, and then end up killing the family, and now you're ratting them out saying that, oh yeah, it's them because I told them about, what? Who are you? Oh my God. Isn't there I thought there was some kind of code, some kind of unspoken code between these guys. Holy cow. Oh, wait a minute. He must have got a reduced sentence or something. Obviously. Nobody does anything in this life for nothing. You knew that. Okay. After 6 weeks of driving around the country, dodging the cops, they finally do get caught in Las Vegas, and they're arrested on December 30th, 1959. During interrogations, they both confess to the detectives of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Back in Kansas, they're tried together at the Finney County Courthouse in Garden City, Kansas in March 1960. The defense wants the men to undergo psychological testing to prove temporary insanity. 3 general doctors say they are absolutely fine, but an experienced psychiatrist says there's a definite sign of mental illness in Smith and feels that the injuries to Hickok that he got on his head when he was in an accident could affect his behavior. This opinion is not admitted in the trial, however, because under Kansas law, the psychiatrist could only opine on the defendant's sanity at the time of the crime. So Alvin Dewey is the chief investigator in the case. He says that Hickok insisted in his confessions that Smith did all the murders. But Smith said that Hickok killed the 2 women. Then he changes his story and says that he killed everyone. So maybe we'll never really know who killed who, but because both men refused to testify in the trial. The jury only deliberates for 45 minutes before they find Hickok and Smith really, really, really guilty of murder. The convictions have a mandatory death sentence attached to them. In their appeals, the men say that they were temporarily insane and that the media coverage of the murders tainted the jury pool and that their attorneys, sucked. But the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. Okay, now we swing back to Truman Capote. So those guys are in prison. They're found guilty. Now we swing back to Truman Capote. He is captivated by a 300-word piece in the November 16th, 1959 New York Times. The story described the unexplained murder of the Clutter family and quoted the local sheriff as saying, quote, "This is apparently the case of a psychopathic killer." Now keep in mind, when Truman Capote reads this article in the New York Times, the men have not been caught yet, so they are on the run. So it's this unexplained murder of this entire family. He gets inspired to cover the story himself, and he decides to write a true crime book detailing the murders and the trial of Hickok and Smith. And remember, he's friends with Harper Lee, who has now won the Pulitzer Prize for To Kill a Mockingbird, which is like crazy amazing. So he calls up his friend Harper Lee, and he brings her with him to Kansas, basically to gain the trust of the locals, since that they would all know her by now and feel like familiar and trust her. They arrive 2 days after the burial of the Clutters, and they visit the scene of the massacre, and they get to know everyone in the small town and the surrounding area. Harper Lee makes inroads into the community by befriending the wives of those Capote wanted to interview. For the next 6 years, although it said 4 earlier, so anywhere between 4 and 6 years, Capote completely immerses himself in the research for his book. He takes 8,000 pages, give or take, of notes, and even includes letters from Smith's army buddy during the trial. While the 2 convicts are in jail, Capote does personal Okay, so while he's in Kansas and he's doing his research and he's talking to the people in the community, Hickok and Smith are captured in Las Vegas, put on trial, and found guilty. So this is all during this same time. With the 2 convicts in jail, Capote does personal interviews with both of them now. This is where things get a little strange, because Capote gets really close to Smith, and in the book he portrays him pretty sympathetically and as being the sensitive one of the 2. Truman Capote's life changes basically forever the day he meets Perry Smith in jail. He uses his connections to get the men legal help and to prolong their time on death row because he's doing research. He doesn't want them to die right away. He's trying to get as much juicy gossip as he can. And during that time, he gets too close to one of the murderers, as we know, Perry Smith. In the book, Smith is portrayed as someone who's a victim of his circumstances, as a tragic character, someone with a childlike understanding, as being highly sensitive, feminine even, and possessed an incredible intuition. Capote confesses to Smith that he cares about him and he wants him to live. And while Capote is assembling his new book, there's a new type of writing style that comes around, pioneered by him, called New Journalism, where the author writes the nonfiction novel or story while it's developing in real life. He does this as he follows the trials and interviews of those who are close to the Clutter family. The result of his research, interviews, and new journalism style is a book called In Cold Blood. So there's a true crime writer at the time named Jack Olson who comments on the untruths that are found in Cold Blood, because there was a lot of, when Cold Blood comes out and people are reading it, people start looking into the details that are put into the book, and the veracity of the book is really scrutinized. So Jack Olson says, quote, "I recognized it as a work of art, but I know fakery when I see it. Capote completely fabricated quotes and whole scenes. The book made something like $6 million in 1960s money, and nobody wanted to discuss anything wrong with a moneymaker like that in the publishing business." Capote's reply, quote, "Jack Olson is just jealous." The book is not completed until after Smith and Hickok are executed. So after 5 years on death row, Hickok and Smith are both executed by hanging at the Kansas City Penitentiary on April 14th, 1965. That sounds like a terrible way to die. You know how we've been covering the death penalty, and they said there was one story where they were saying the gas, somebody had suffered too much with the gas, so now they're going to do lethal injection because so there's not undue distress and harm and etc. I mean, hanging seems like you're going out of your way for distress and harm and like undue, whatever the term, undue harm. And hanging just seems so vulgar and like, oh my God. So anyway, they were hung. Oh, were they? Patrick? I don't know. I have not seen any nude pictures of them. Although, if we ask Capote, oh no, he's dead too. Okay. So they're about to be hung, and they're about to die, and they're asked if they have any last words, to which Hickok doesn't. But Smith yells out to the media who are nearby, quote, "Capital punishment is legally and morally wrong." Hickok is executed and pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. after hanging for 20 minutes. This is what I'm talking about. He was hanging for 20 minutes before he's pronounced dead? So was he alive for the whole 20 minutes? That's a long time. I mean, to be hanging and gasping. Okay, he's 36 years old. Also, why in the wee hours of the morning? 12:41 a.m.? And Smith is pronounced dead at 1:19 a.m. at age 33. I mean, they were both so young. Capote, who is present at the hangings, isn't ready for what he sees. The man he got so close to over the past years was swinging for 10 minutes before he's pronounced dead. And after he leaves the prison, he has to pull over to the side of the road because he can't see through all the tears. Smith's death would completely change the trajectory of Capote's life. The book, In Cold Blood, is published as a 4-part serial in The New Yorker starting September 25th, 1965. It's an instant hit, especially in Kansas, where The New Yorker sells out immediately. The success leads to a book deal with Random House, who publishes it on January 17th, 1966, and the nonfiction novel, as Capote labels it, brings him literary acclaim and becomes an international bestseller even today. It's the second best-selling true crime book in publishing history, only behind Vincent Bugliosi's 1974 book Helter Skelter about the Charles Manson murders. I need to read both of these books. The book is praised for its eloquent prose, extensive detail, and triple narrative describing the lives of the murderers, the victims, and other members of the rural community. The psychologies and backgrounds of Hickok and Smith are given special attention, as is the pair's complex relationship during and after the murders. In Cold Blood is regarded by critics as a pioneering work in the true crime genre, but of course Capote is disappointed that the book does not win the Pulitzer Prize. Oh, your friend got one, why don't you have one? The notoriety of the murders and the success of Capote's novel have lasting effects for the small Kansas town, with the residents losing their trust in others. Quote, "Doors were locked. Strangers eyed with suspicion. In the years that follow, many of the residents feel that Capote took advantage of their tragedy and that the community neighborliness was gone and only fear was left." Due to the success of the book, Capote gets so famous and known for his true crime work that the Senate calls him to help with an examination of the case. The trial also brings into focus a national discussion about the death penalty and mental health. Capote, for his part, expressed his opinion after releasing the book that he was against the death penalty. Well, yeah, because his little lovebird was hanged. In the years since it's published, Capote gets swept away in the world of the jet set. So Gore Vidal, and I'm going to say it. I had to Google these people. Mailer, I had heard, but I had to Google who he was. Vidal, of course I've heard, but I had to Google. If you're unfamiliar, he's a writer, public intellectual, known for his wit, and he's openly bisexual. He's a writer. So Vidal and Capote, they basically hate each other. They're sworn enemies. Vidal says of Capote and the jet set, quote, "Truman Capote has tried, with some success, to get into a world that I have tried, with some success, to get out of." During the next period of his life, Capote starts on a downward spiral. In the late 1960s, he becomes friends with Lee Radziwill, who is the sister of Jackie O. She wants to be an actress, and Capote writes a teleplay adaptation of the film Laura for her. The thing is a total failure, and it's basically his first professional setback. Then, on November 28th, 1966, he hosts the legendary masked ball called the Black and White Ball in the Grand Ballroom of New York City's Plaza Hotel. I mean, this is a party that was the social event, not of the year, but like of the years that followed. Like, this is, if you ever wanted to be at a party, well, it's kind of like, everyone clamoring to get into Studio 54. Very similar. Everybody wanted to go to this party. And he was just making a lot of enemies by snubbing his friends and deciding who was in, and who was out. So he was really playing favorites. He was stacking the rooms with everyone who was hot and famous and whoever he wanted to. It was really the place you wanted to be, the party you wanted. I wanted to go. Oh, wait, I wasn't alive. Okay. Then he buys a house in Palm Springs and he starts to really lose focus and he pounds back the booze, which really drives a wedge between him and his longtime companion, Dumpy, who are separated for most of the 70s. He never finishes another novel after In Cold Blood. Instead, he appears on trashy talk shows. In 1973, he meets a man at a New York City bathhouse named John O'Shea. He's married with 3 kids, does not identify as gay or bisexual or anything. I mean, you're in a sling. I mean, you don't need to identify as anything. Anyway, they get serious. He moves out to Palm Springs with Capote, and he becomes his manager. This seems like a really unhealthy relationship. But all the while, he just wanted to basically be Capote, and he tries to take control of Capote's financials. It ends, of course. Capote continues his downward spiral in 1975 with the publication of La Côte Basque in Esquire magazine. He commits social suicide by throwing all of his famous friends under the bus. Many of them female, whom he calls his swans. So basically, he's killing his swans. Some have pseudonyms, others are called out by their real names. The writing reveals some of their dirtiest laundry of the New York City elite, and as a result, he finds himself on the outside of New York society looking in. Basically, his worst nightmare come true. He had everything he wanted, and he just self-destructed. In the late 70s, he's in and out of drug rehab and has numerous breakdowns. On a talk show, Capote appears high as a kite and tells the crowd he's been up for 48 hours. Okay, I watched this on YouTube. You can search Truman Capote drunk, and it'll come up. And, I mean, they say that he's drunk, but he's telling the audience and the host of the show that he's been up for 48 hours. You don't stay up for 48 hours because you've been drinking, do you? That sounds like amphetamines to me. He's slurry, he's unfocused, but if you have been up for 48 hours, that's what happens. You're sleep deprived. Trust me, been there, done that. So the host on the show, on the clip, asks, what's going to happen unless you lick the problem of drugs and alcohol? And Capote responded, quote, the obvious answer is that eventually, I'll kill myself without meaning to. The live broadcast makes national headlines. It's really uncomfortable to watch. So go watch it. Truman Capote drunk on YouTube. Then he goes on to burn every bridge basically he's ever made with all of his rich and powerful friends. He spills all their secrets and talk shows and to whoever will listen. He's seen partying with Andy Warhol at Studio 54. My God, imagine the substance abuse going on at Studio 54. I wanted to go to Studio 50. Oh, I was too young. Oh, yeah. As we all know, the gays hate to age. We have exacting standards that are cruel and unrealistic that can give any normal person a complex. And Capote, of course, is no different. He gets a facelift, he loses a bunch of weight, and he's experimenting now with hair transplants. He loses his license due to speeding near his Long Island home and has a hallucinatory, oh, that's a funny word when you say it out loud. He has a hallucinatory seizure in 1980 and lands him in the hospital. This is where he starts to withdraw from the world. The hallucinations continue, and a brain scan shows that his brain mass has actually shrunk, which sounds weird, like his brain is shrinking. He spends his time planning a revival of his infamous ball, the black and white ball, but this time he wants to hold it either in Los Angeles or in South America somewhere, but this never happens. By the beginning of the 1980s, he's bored with New York City, and he heads back west to California. In 1983, he writes Remembering Tennessee, a tribute to Tennessee Williams, who died in February of that year. Then, a month before his 60th birthday, Truman Capote dies in Bel Air, Los Angeles, on August 25th, 1984. The cause of death is liver disease complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. He dies at home with his friend Joan Carson. She's the ex-wife of Johnny Carson, just so you know. Gore Vidal... Oh my God, this is good. It's funny. He's witty. He's a writer. Okay, I'll just read it. Gore Vidal responded to the news of Capote's death by calling it, quote, a wise career move. That's really clever. Okay. He's cremated and his ashes are divided between his friend Joan Carson and his lifetime partner, Jack Dumpy. His ashes are stolen not once, but twice from Joan, but returned each time. Who's taking his ashes? Is it a fan? Is it somebody who thinks that they can get money for it on eBay? When Breakfast at Tiffany's is on Broadway in 2013, the producers of the show offer to fly both Joan Carson and Capote's ashes out to New York for the show. She declines the offer. Like, Capote's ashes are more popular than conspiracy theories are in the U.S. politics. I mean, like, honestly, they're flying his ashes around to see Broadway shows? I mean, I would like to see a Broadway show. Can somebody send me a ticket? I'm still alive. His ashes. I mean, what a weird thing to do. Oh my God. I'm sure his ashes would love to see the show. Like, so weird. In Capote's will, he ensures that a literary trust is set that gets its funds from the revenues of his works, and those are to fund various literary prizes, fellowships, and scholarships, including the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism in memory of Newton Arvin. Arvin, so you know, was Capote's pal and a writer who lost his job when it came out that he was gay. And so ends the roller coaster life of a man who found fame writing a true crime book about a family who is mercilessly murdered in their home, getting too close to his subject, and then spiraled down a dark abyss, a victim of drugs and alcohol. So on the People.com article that I read, they had an interview with some of the family members of the Clutter family. I mean, it's the granddaughter and stuff of the survivors from that night. So as we know, the survivors from that night are the two eldest daughters, because they had already moved out to start their families, Beverly and Ivana. So, lost in the flurry of fanfare of the success of Capote's book, the Clutter family feel their loved ones, who they lost that night, were lost again in the frenzy of the story, and that they actually became secondary to the story and were not actually accurately portrayed. So, though the Clutters were unhappy with the book and the legacy it leaves behind, the family for decades, they don't say anything until 2017, when Sundance TV's Cold-Blooded: The Clutter Family Murders, a 2-part documentary, airs as part of the network's True Crime Weekend Marathon. Quote, "With this project, we felt like it's the right time and the right venue as a documentary to get the true story out about who Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter were as people, not just how they died," says the Clutter's granddaughter, who asked not to be identified. So the 4-hour docuseries features new information about the case, never before seen footage, and photographs for the first time ever, on-camera interviews with Clutter family members. Quote, "Grandpa accomplished a lot in his 48 years, but think of all the things he didn't get to do and that we lost out on," says the granddaughter. The two surviving sisters, were told, dealt with the killings and its aftermath, quote, "with their faith and family and the close friends that supported them, but mainly their faith, knowing that it doesn't end here and they're going to see them again." The granddaughter says her family today is tight-knit, brought closer together by the tragedy nearly 60 years ago. Quote, "What happened caused us to focus more on the strength and support of our family and help one another," she said. "There is a strong bond of care and love between our family members." Her mother, who is one of the surviving daughters, cherishes time with her children as a result of what she endured. She says, quote, "She wants to be as close with us, as in touch as possible. I feel like part of that is because she doesn't want to lose people." Yeah, sometimes we don't think about that, right? You hear about a murder and then it feels like an end, but you don't realize that you don't always think maybe about the survivors, and then, or you might think about them in the short term, but then what does that look like long term for a family to lose the husband, the wife, and 2 kids, and then the 2 eldest daughters obviously have their own families, so the ripple effect of that, and then they have children, but the story, because it's been immortalized this way, and we're going to go into a few more mediums in which it was immortalized, sort of goes on and on. So how does the family pass that on? What do they do with the tragedy, and what do they do with the fact that this story continues, because it doesn't sort of allow them to move very far past this, because it's kind of always there on the periphery. So, something to think about. So in 1967, the film In Cold Blood, which is a neo-noir crime film directed by Richard Brooks, and it's based on the novel obviously, and it stars John Forsythe of Dynasty fame, and he's an investigator in the show. The film, oh, get this, is shot on location. It's on location where Smith and Hickok's crimes occurred, including the real Clutter family home, where obviously they robbed and murdered the family. It's filmed in the house. They didn't build a set. It's filmed in the house. It's nominated for 4 Academy Awards: Best Director, Original Score, Cinematography, Adapted Screenplay. Then in 1996, a miniseries comes out based on the book. It's 2 parts. It airs on CBS in 1996. It stars Eric Roberts as Perry Smith, Anthony Edwards as Dick Hickok, and Sam Neill as Agent Alvin Dewey. Eric Roberts. Did I ever tell you guys I shared a steam room with Eric Roberts once? Yeah. True story. 2005, the film Capote comes out. This one you probably have seen, or at least remember. This one is starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, and the film primarily follows the events during the writing of Capote's book, In Cold Blood. It was filmed mostly in Manitoba, which is here in Canada. It's released on September 30th, 2005, coinciding with Capote's birthday, which is kind of a nice touch. The film receives acclaim from critics for Hoffman's lead performance and wins several awards, including the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of the title character. And then, of course, there's the book, In Cold Blood, written by Truman Capote himself, which I'm going to order on Amazon as soon as this recording is done, which is right about now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of True Gay Crime. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to find the True Gay Crime Facebook page and follow us on Instagram at True Gay Crime. And we'd love to hear from you. Do you have an LGBTQ crime story from your city? You can send your story to truegaycrime@gmail.com, and I'll share it on a future episode of the show. Did you know you can subscribe, rate, and review True Gay Crime on Apple Podcasts? It would mean everything to me if you did, because it helps me create content you like, and it lets Apple know to share it with more people. Thank you for listening. And remember, always look behind you, lock your doors, tell someone where you're going, and look out for each other.
Why can't we all just get along?